If the Aztecs were so famous, why do they still feel like a rumor with teeth marks? Why does a civilization that filled a lake with stone and song arrive to the present as scattered pictures, half-translated words and testimonies that seem to sweat with motive? Something is missing, and it is not only gold, not only temples, not only lives. It is continuity. It is the feeling that a hand once held the whole story, and then the fingers opened, slowly, deliberately, and let it fall into dark water. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And if you feel like it, share your location and your local time in the comments, just a quiet signal from your corner of the night to mine. There is an odd contradiction at the beginning of any journey into the Aztecs, or the Mexica as they called themselves. They are said to have been meticulous record keepers, painters of history, accountants of tribute, watchers of calendars that turned like interlocking gears. And yet, when one goes looking for their own voice, unbroken, unfiltered, unafraid, the corridor narrows, the air changes, the torches go out. The usual explanation is simple: conquest, fire, conversion, the systematic destruction of books painted on deerskin and bark paper, the shredding of memory in the name of salvation. It is true that codices were burned, that images were treated like infection, but simple explanations rarely remain simple when one keeps touching them, because not everything was burned. Some codices survived, some were hidden, some were recopied under new rules, with Latin letters pressed onto Nahuatl sounds, with Spanish questions guiding indigenous answers. And still, even in survival, there is a tremor, a sense that what remains has been taught to wear someone else's face. One can feel it in the way the sources argue with each other without speaking. Conquistadors describing a city they want to possess, missionaries describing beliefs they want to uproot, indigenous nobles describing ancestry they want to preserve in courts that demand proof in alien formats, informants speaking to friars decades after the siege, remembering through grief, through fear, through the slow pressure of a new world that insists the old one was a mistake. If history is a body, then these are not clean bones laid out on a table. These are bones that have been carried, traded, buried, unearthed, and handled by hands with needs. So the first mystery is not a single dramatic question, like where the gold went, or whether Moctezuma truly thought Cortés was a god. The first mystery is quieter. Why is the channel between the Mexica and us filled with so much noise? Why is it that the more we read, the more the shape of the truth seems to shimmer, as if the surface of the past is not solid stone but lake water at night, disturbed by unseen fish? It is tempting to blame everything on the Spaniards, to make them the sole editors of silence. But that is another comfort, and comforts are not always accurate. Even before the Spaniards, the Mexica were already curating themselves. Empires do that. They choose which ancestors to praise and which to forget. They turn inconvenient rivals into barbarians and adopt convenient ruins as sacred inheritance. They commission histories that justify rule, that align victory with cosmic necessity. When later chroniclers tell us that the Mexica came from Aztlan, that they wandered under the guidance of a god, that they were chosen to found a city on an omen, Are we hearing a memory or a state myth that became memory because it was repeated until it hardened? And what is Aztlan really? A place, a symbol, a political poem, a moving origin that can be carried like a banner. No one has found it in a way that ends the debate, and perhaps that is the point. Some origins are designed not to be pinned down, because a pinned down origin can be challenged, invaded, taxed, mocked. A missed origin can follow you anywhere and still feel true. Between that mist and the later catastrophe lies a city that once astonished Europe. Tenochtitlan rising from the lake, causeways like long straight thoughts, canals reflecting temples, markets where thousands move through order and noise. The accounts of its scale are not merely romantic. Archaeology has confirmed enough to make the spine tingle. Under the modern city, the stones still keep their posture. Excavations at the Templo Mayor have pulled offerings back into the light. Obsidian blades, shells from distant coasts, jaguar remains, carved masks, layers of ritual like sediment, each deposit a decision. The earth remembers even when paper is ash, and yet the earth also edits. Water rots, roots invade, stone is reused. Colonial Mexico City was built on the body of Tenochtitlan, and that is not only metaphor. The conquest did not just kill people, it rearranged space. It forced the sacred geography into new streets, new churches, new property lines. When you stand in the historic centre today, you are standing on a palimpsest, a page scraped and written over again. The past is there, but it is not allowed to be whole. There is another kind of rupture that is less talked about, because it feels less personal, but it may be just as influential. The basin of Mexico itself changed. The lake system was gradually drained and engineered in the colonial era, altering what could survive underground, altering what kinds of archaeology are possible, altering even the imagination. It is harder to feel a lake city when the lake has been turned into absence. When the water is gone, the mind becomes less able to believe in water as foundation. A world built on reflected sky begins to sound like fantasy, even when it was engineering. So now the doubt from this first stretch of fog, when we say the Aztecs, are we touching the living people of the past, or are we touching a colonial object, a constructed image assembled from surviving fragments and convenient emphasis? When a modern retelling lingers on blood and spectacle, is that because sacrifice was truly the centre of everything, or because horror travels better than poetry? When a modern retelling romanticizes the city, is that because beauty was truly the daily atmosphere, or because we need a lost paradise to mourn? Either way, the story becomes a mirror. And the mirror is dangerous because it can be used. It can be used to justify conquest, to justify nationalism, to justify stereotypes, to justify the feeling that a civilization deserved its end, or that it was too glorious to have truly existed without supernatural help. The Aztecs become a stage where other people rehearse their own beliefs about violence, faith, and fate. But the Mexica themselves were also rehearsing. They lived inside cycles, suns that died, worlds that ended. Time as something that could break and be restarted, not once, but repeatedly. If a people believes the universe has rebooted before, what does that do to their sense of historical security? If they believe the present sun is borrowed light, paid for with blood and obligation, what do they fear will happen if the payment stops? And if they believe that collapses are natural, even sacred, might they interpret political disaster as cosmic schedule rather than human failure? That thought can make the conquest feel eerily pre-written, as if the empire's fall was always waiting in the calendar. But that is another seduction. The truth may be more mundane and more terrifying. Misunderstanding, opportunism, old grudges between city-states, the sudden arrival of pathogens to bodies with no immunological memory, and the unbearable speed at which a world can change when systems are tightly coupled. A lake city is an engineering miracle, but it is also a system of dependencies. Food, tribute, alliances, water control, ritual legitimacy. Pull one thread, and the tapestry loosens. Still, even if the causes were practical, why does the narrative feel curated, as if someone wanted the ending to look inevitable? Why do the famous omens feel like they were written with hindsight ink? Why do certain scenes repeat across accounts with the rhythm of myth? A comet, a flame in the sky, voices weeping at night, a mirror showing warriors arriving, a temple struck by lightning. Are these memories of terror, or literary devices shaped later to make trauma intelligible? Does a conquered people retell disaster in prophetic form to reclaim a kind of dignity? To say, we were warned, we were not blind, the universe spoke to us, even if we could not stop it? And if so, who else might have shaped the warning? Priests, chroniclers, colonial editors, or time itself, which erodes randomness and leaves behind patterns that look deliberate because the mind cannot sleep beside chaos. So the first part ends where it began, with missingness. Not just missing books, but missing confidence. The Aztec past is a room full of echoes, and the echoes may not all come from the same mouth. Somewhere in the silence there is a question that does not want to be answered quickly. If a civilization can be reduced to a handful of surviving texts and a field of stones beneath a modern city, what else can be reduced? What else can be made to look like it was always meant to disappear? And if the Mexica believed that worlds can end and begin again, then one more whisper slips into the dark. Was their collapse only a conquest? Or was it also a kind of reboot, with someone deciding what version of the story would be allowed to restart? If the rupture in the last part lived in scorched pages and voices forced to detour through chujaining mouths, then this rupture drifts farther back, to the place they claimed they stepped out from. And yet the strange thing is this: the closer one crawls toward the beginning, the less it behaves like a point on a map. It behaves like mist. They called it Aztlan, as if naming a homeland could make it sit still, as if a word could be a shoreline. But why does it keep slipping? If Aztlan was real, why does it refuse to be found? If it was not, why does it pull so hard on destiny, like a hook buried deep under the tongue? In the records that reach the present by way of many hands, the Mexica migration is often told with a confident rhythm, a long departure, a wandering marked by stations, by renamed places, by rituals carried like a shadow that never leaves the heel. The story arrives polished, as if it has been repeated until it becomes smooth enough to pass between teeth without cutting. But living memory is rarely that smooth. True memory has jagged edges, missing days, contradictions that do not apologize. Here, though, Aztlan sometimes feels like a stage set, placed just long enough to push a people into the light of chosen, then whisked away before anyone can study the ground beneath their feet. And once the word chosen is spoken, every later step begins to sound scheduled, as if the road was waiting for them before they were born. There are clues as thin as feather barbs, the kind that catch on the skin but do not anchor. Nahuatl, with its branches and dialects, leaves traces like fingerprints in clay, each community a little different, each difference a hint of separation, contact, blending. Linguists follow shifts in sound, borrowed words, patterns of grammar that drift when people drift. Language is a river, and rivers carry silt from everywhere they have been. A migrating group should change its voice, forget some old sounds, pick up new ones, become altered by trade, marriage, war, weather. And yet Aztlan, across multiple traditions, can feel strangely unweathered, a bright stone held above the current, protected from erosion because it has become a symbol. Is that devotion to a remembered homeland? Or is it the mark of deliberate grooming, a story polished so that many factions can say it together, in chorus when facing rivals? We come from a sacred place, therefore we have the right. Even the names they wore seem to change like masks swapped in dim light. Mexica, Tenochtitlan, and the broader, slippery label Chichimeca, sometimes used to mean northern nomads, sometimes used with a sting, sometimes reclaimed as a kind of fierce pedigree. It is curious how empires want to be two things at once, refined heirs of ancient grandeur and also children of harsh margins. One identity offers inheritance, the right to stand inside older ruins and call them ancestors. The other offers raw legitimacy, the strength of survival, the romance of the untamed. Was there truly a single line of descent? Or did they need both stories braided together to hold power in a landscape where everyone was watching everyone else, measuring whose blood was civilized, whose gods were true, whose past was deep? Politics in such a world does not always rewrite history with ink. It can rewrite with ceremony, with song, with painted pages where time and space mingle like dream logic. In codices, a road is not a road so much as a chain of signs, each place a glyph, each event a picture, each transition less like cartography and more like remembered emotion. The tragedy is that many of the codices that survive belong to the after, not the before. And even when indigenous hands held the brush, other hands often held the questions. Colonial courts demanded proof of land. Friars demanded explanations of gods. Administrators demanded genealogies that could be filed and taxed. So Aztlan appears again and again as an origin point that functions like paperwork, a beginning that authorizes the present. But when an origin becomes a legal instrument, what happens to its truth? Does it remain memory, or does it harden into a tool? Some modern hypotheses try to nail the mist to the earth. They look northwest toward arid landscapes and distant waters, toward regions where Nahuatl-speaking populations existed beyond the basin of Mexico, toward the possibility of multiple migration waves after older political orders weakened. Some scholars point to climate stress, droughts, resource pressure, the quiet hand of ecology pushing communities to move. Others suggest Aztlan might not have been a single place at all, but a concept that condensed many departures into one poetic point of origin. Each attempt to pin it down produces a strange softness, like sand slipping between fingers. The evidence can fit more than one narrative: a lake, a mountain, a word in a chronicle, a parallel myth, a trade route, a ceramic style. None of it stands up alone and says, "Here." And perhaps that refusal is the whole mechanism. The past does not speak in coordinates. It murmurs. What is hard to ignore is how ritualized the migration story often feels. The Mexica leave, they wander, they are pushed aside, hired as mercenaries, tolerated at the margins, mocked for being latecomers, hungry, barbarous. Then, eventually, the pattern flips, and the people once shoved from one place to another become the ones who do the shoving. It is an intoxicating arc. It turns humiliation into proof of worth. It turns scarcity into spiritual training. It tells listeners that power is destiny wearing the disguise of hardship. And it hypnotizes because it offers a cruel comfort. If greatness is pre-written, then suffering can be interpreted as a necessary chapter rather than meaningless pain. But destiny is an easy garment to wear after victory. Before victory, there are only blistered feet, cold nights, arguments, children crying, elders slowing down, bodies breaking. Those parts rarely survive in official origin tales. Were they sanded away because a later state did not want to remember weakness? Or because, after the conquest, survivors needed a high beginning to withstand a low ending, needed the story to rise like a pillar so the collapse would not crush the mind completely? And then there is the god that walks beside the story like a drumbeat heard through walls. Huitzilopochtli, the patron, the one who guides, demands, binds. Even gods have histories, and scholars have argued about how and when his prominence rose, whether it was ancient continuity or a later intensification that served an increasingly militarized identity. When a coalition needs to become a single body, it often chooses a single sacred center, a voice that everyone agrees to obey. A god can be glue. A god can be a flag. A god can be a way of turning politics into inevitability, because to disagree becomes not merely treason but cosmic error. So what came first? Belief or necessity? And if they came together, entwined like roots under water, is there any clean way to separate faith from strategy without tearing both? In modern times, Aztlan has lived again a symbol, reclaimed in movements of identity and belonging, a word that carries longing and defiance. That afterlife is real, and it matters. But it also shows how a name can be used by many eras for many purposes, each layer of meaning laid gently on top of the last, until the original ground, if there ever was one, becomes unreachable. Symbols survive by refusing to be fully tested. They survive by staying useful. They survive by keeping just enough fog so that anyone can step into them without being forced to surrender the story they need. So perhaps the question is not merely, where was Aztlan? The question is why an empire might need a birthplace that cannot be found, why a beginning that cannot be excavated, measured, disproved, or mocked. Is ambiguity here a flaw, or is it design? And if it is design, who designed it? Palace storytellers shaping legitimacy, priests reading calendars and turning politics into prophecy, nobles speaking to colonial courts, translating themselves into the language of documents, or time itself, the invisible sculptor, carving messy realities into clean arcs because humans cannot sleep beside chaos. If a civilization can enter history through a homeland made of mist, then it can also exit through another curtain of mist. And between those two veils, something may have been hidden from the first telling, not because it was unknown, but because it was too dangerous to pin down. Because if the true origin were touched, the spell might break. And what happens to an empire or to a people when the spell that holds their story together finally loses its grip? If Aztlan is a beginning that refuses to sit still, then the next contradiction is stranger, because here the ground does not move at all. The Mexica arrive in the basin of Mexico and step into a landscape already crowded with ruins that feel older than memory, as if the valley has been inhabited by more than just people, as if it has been inhabited by endings. And yet the accounts that survive often speak as though history begins when the Mexica begin. Why does the valley feel like a room where someone has quietly removed the furniture, leaving only dust outlines on the floor? Who lived here so completely that their absence still has weight? And why does that weight keep being repurposed, renamed, inherited, and stolen? There is a city that haunts the valley like a giant thought that no one can finish. Teotihuacan. Even the name most people use is not the name it called itself, but a later Nahuatl word that can be translated as the place where gods were made, or where they were born, or where they gathered, depending on how the breath falls between syllables. It is a label laid on top of silence. When the Mexica saw its pyramids, the story goes, they felt awe, and they folded the ruins into their own cosmic history. But awe is also a kind of opportunism, isn't it? When you stand in front of something too large to explain, the mind either admits ignorance or it invents ancestry. Teotihuacan's scale is not delicate. It is deliberate. The Avenue of the Dead, the pyramids of the sun and moon, the careful alignment of space, the sense that the city was designed to shape the body and the gaze. Archaeology has pulled back enough layers to show that it was once full of colour, murals, workshops, apartments, and people from different regions, speaking different tongues, living under a shared order. And then, somehow, it broke. Fires burned in certain sectors. Power fractured. The city thinned out. The reasons remain debated, and that debate is a kind of fog that keeps returning no matter how many lamps are brought in. Internal revolt. Elite conflict. Drought and resource pressure. Shifting trade routes. A slow unravelling or a sudden wound. The evidence can be read like a dream where the same symbols rearrange themselves each time you wake. But the deeper question is not only why Teotihuacan fell, it is why its fall left such a usable corpse. Ruins can be left alone. Ruins can be feared. Ruins can be ignored like old scars. Yet in central Mexico, old ruins were not merely ruins. They were instruments. Later peoples went to Teotihuacan as if to a shrine. not to mourn but to borrow legitimacy, to touch the stones and come away with the authority of age on their skin. The Mexica were not the first to do this. They arrived late to a valley where inheritance was already a language of power, and the oldest sentence in that language was written in broken masonry. One can almost hear the logic working under the myth. If a new dynasty wants to be taken seriously, it helps to appear inevitable. If it helps to appear inevitable, it helps to appear ancient. If you're not ancient, you can stand inside someone else's antiquity and pretend it recognizes you. This is not an accusation so much as a human pattern. People do it with family stories, with heirlooms, with national flags. But here, in this basin of lakes and volcanoes, the pattern becomes geological. The past is not merely remembered, it is quarried. Then there is the Toltec shadow, another presence that feels both solid and slippery. Tula, with its famous warrior columns, its echoes of an earlier order, its fragments that suggest artistry and violence braided together. The Mexica and many neighbours spoke of the Toltecs as if they were the original masters of civilization, the inventors of refinement, the standard by which later greatness could be measured. To be Toltec in some contexts could mean not simply a person from a city, but a person skilled, cultured, legitimate. Yet the more one tries to grip the Toltecs as a single historical entity, the more they behave like a mask worn by many faces. Was Toltec a precise identity, or was it a prestige word that floated, attaching itself to whatever later elites wanted to sanctify? If the Toltecs were real, what exactly were they? A state, a network, a cultural style, a memory of Teotihuacan refracted through centuries. Here the valley offers another rupture. The way history turns into adjective, the way real people can dissolve into a concept that others can claim. It is a softer form of conquest by naming. And somewhere in that shadow moves the figure of Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent, wind and dawn, priest and god and legend and moral argument. In some traditions, a ruler or culture hero associated with Tolan is cast out, tricked, exiled, promising return, leaving behind a story that later ages could bend into warning or hope. But the sources that preserve these narratives come to us through filters, post-conquest compilations, colonial pens, indigenous informants navigating dangerous questions. How much of the Quetzalcoatl story is pre-Hispanic continuity, and how much was reshaped in a world newly obsessed with sin, temptation, and exile? The serpent is old. The moral framing may be newer, and in the gap between them, a listener can feel how easily a myth can be tuned to whatever frequency power requires. So when the Mexica later described themselves as inheritors, when they invoked Toltec prestige, when they framed their own city as the center of a cosmos that had already broken and restarted, was this devotion or strategy? Perhaps it was both, in the way hunger and prayer can become indistinguishable. The Mexica did not walk into an empty valley. They walked into a crowded archive where the documents were pyramids and the ink was absence. Yet the most unsettling possibility is that the valley's earlier collapses taught everyone a lesson no one wanted to say aloud, that greatness is temporary, that the sun itself might be on a schedule. A city can be enormous and still fall. A trade network can feel like a permanent bloodstream and still clot. A sacred center can be abandoned, and later visitors will stand among its stones, imagining gods and founders, while never knowing the names of the people who cooked, argued, loved, and died there. If Teotihuacan could vanish into reverence, why couldn't anyone? This is where the Mexica story begins to look less like a clean ascent and more like a careful occupation of other people's ghosts. They entered the basin as outsiders, yes, but outsiders who could read a very old script. The script of taking what remains and making it speak for you. They did not invent this script. They learned it because everyone in the basin had learned it. The valley itself may have taught it. The way the land offers lessons in drought and flood. And perhaps the valley offered one more lesson, quieter than ruins, that water remembers differently than stone. The lake system reflected temples and skies, but it also erased tracks. It swallowed offerings. It shifted shorelines. Settlements rose and fell at the mercy of water control, rainfall patterns and sediment. If a catastrophe came, a drought or a flood or a slow ecological tightening, it would not leave a single dramatic scar. It would leave subtle distortions, like a song slowly drifting out of tune. Later chroniclers could interpret those distortions as fate, as divine displeasure, as prophecy. But what if some endings were simply the basin's long breath, inhaling and exhaling civilizations? So the doubt that opens at the end of this part is simple and cold. When the Mexica built their legitimacy, did they build it on truth or on carefully selected ruins? And if they did what most rising powers do, if they claimed inheritance and erased inconvenient predecessors, then what else might have been erased before the Spaniards ever arrived with fire and crosses? How many Aztec stories are already second-hand, already built from fragments of older collapses that the Mexica themselves could not fully decode, only revere and reuse? Because once a valley becomes a museum of vanished powers, a new empire does not merely rule people, it rules interpretation. It decides which ruins are sacred, which are irrelevant, which ancestors count, which do not. And if interpretation is a form of control, then the basin was already under conquest long before 1519. The conquest of the past, by the present, repeated in cycles like waves returning to the same shoreline. And now, with Teotihuacan's silence pressing close, with Tula's shadow stretching across centuries, one question refuses to settle. If the Mexica stepped into a landscape of previous endings and made those endings serve their beginning, what does that suggest about their own ending, still waiting ahead in the story? Was it an interruption from outside? Or was it the valley doing what it has done before, quietly selecting what will survive and what will be turned into mist for someone else to inherit? If the valley was already a library of vanished powers, then the next contradiction is almost tender. How does a people who arrive late, who are mocked as outsiders, who carry the smell of the road and the awkwardness of hunger, manage to place their capital at the very centre of the basin's attention? Not on the safest ridge, not on the richest shore, but out on the water, on an island that seems like a mistake. A city that would later look inevitable, yet in the beginning might have looked like a trap. Was it truly a sacred choice, guided by a sign? Or was it the kind of choice people make when every door on land is already guarded? The story most listeners know is neat enough to fit into a single painted image. An eagle, A cactus, something held in its beak, the sun striking its feathers like a verdict. They are told to build there. They build. The myth is beautiful because it behaves like destiny, and destiny is a lullaby for power. But even within the tradition, the sign flickers. Sometimes it is a serpent. Sometimes it is a bird of prey without the later patriotic certainty. Sometimes the cactus is emphasized, sometimes the rock, sometimes the place name, sometimes the god who demanded obedience. If the sign was so clear, why does it arrive to the present with so many versions? And if it was not clear, if it was chosen after the fact, then what does that say about the way a state teaches its people to remember? There is a quieter possibility that does not kill the myth, but makes it more human. In a basin thick with rivals, an island is defensible. It is inconvenient, yes, but inconvenience can be turned into advantage when everyone else is too comfortable. Water is a wall that moves. Causeways can be controlled. Canoes can be watched. A city on the lake forces visitors to arrive on your terms, along narrow paths where diplomacy and danger share the same corridor. And the basin's politics were already a web of city-states, alliances that could invert overnight, old grudges that waited patiently for new opportunities. The Mexica, still finding their shape, might have needed a place where they could not be easily surrounded, a place where they could become hard before they became admired. But then the engineering begins, and with it another kind of mystery. How does a city grow on water without collapsing into water? The answer is partly visible in the Chinampas, those cultivated plots built in the shallow lake, often described as floating gardens, though they were more anchored than floating, bound by stakes and trees, layered with mud and vegetation, fed by canals. It sounds like a pastoral miracle, and in a way it is, because it makes food where food should not easily be. Yet the Chinampa system also behaves like a secret contract with the ecosystem. It depends on water quality, on careful dredging, on the rhythm of seasons, on labor that never stops. It is an agricultural machine disguised as a garden. And like any machine, it asks a question that histories sometimes soften. Who kept it running day after day, when the imperial story preferred to talk about gods and warriors? Here, the evidence comes not as a lecture, but as a kind of murmur from mud. Archaeologists can map old canal patterns, find pollen traces and plant remains, identify the layered construction that made those fields resilient. The city's growth becomes legible as a series of choices, repeated so many times they become landscape. But because so much of the basin was later drained, remade and built over, the full shape of those choices is partly missing. The water that once preserved some things also swallowed others, and the colonial reshaping of the lake system erased the old shoreline's memory. So when one tries to imagine early Tenochtitlan, the mind is forced to reconstruct a world that the modern ground refuses to show in full. The city was real, the engineering was real, and yet the everyday logistics remained shadowed, as if the most important work was also the least recorded. And perhaps that is not an accident. An empire's official memory rarely lingers on the hands that carry mud, the backs that bend in the rain, the arguments over water rights, the slow maintenance that keeps brilliance from rotting. Official memory prefers signs, omens, founders. It prefers the moment of founding to the centuries of upkeep. So the founding story becomes a stage light, and everything that made the light possible waits in the dark behind it. Still, there is another layer, more intimate and more uneasy. The Mexica did not build in isolation. They entered a lake already known, already used, already politically owned in fragments. The island sites and shorelines were connected to older settlements, to tributary relations, to the powerful cities nearby that could tolerate a new group only so long as it remained useful. The Mexica were, by many accounts, first allowed to settle as dependents, paying rent in labour or loyalty. Sometimes they were forced into the least desirable spaces, the marshy edges, the places that smelled of reeds and insects. If so, then the sacred omen may have arrived as a kind of retroactive dignity, a way of turning humiliation into holiness. To be pushed into the lake and then to claim, "We chose the lake," is not merely propaganda. It is psychological survival, the transformation of insult into identity. The name of the city itself carries this double edge, because names in Nahuatl can hold multiple meanings and resonances, and later spellings can harden what was once flexible. Tenochtitlan is often linked to the figure Tenoch and to the stone cactus, but even that feels like a knot of politics and poetry tied together. Founders can be real people, and also invented ancestors, and sometimes both at once, a historical figure dressed in myth, so that the city's origin cannot be separated from sacred authority. The closer one looks, the more the boundary between event and curated memory starts to blur, not because anyone was lying in a simple way, but because the act of founding a capital is itself a form of storytelling. You do not simply build walls. You build a reason to obey, and obedience was needed because the lake does not forgive carelessness. Dikes and causeways, aqueducts and canals, all of it required coordination, planning and leadership strong enough to compel labour. Later sources describe the building of causeways stretching to the shores, the management of salt and fresh water, the shaping of the city into a grid of neighbourhoods, each with its own identity, obligations and pride. But the earlier phases are harder to see clearly, because the chronicles that speak of them were often written later, when the city's greatness demanded an origin worthy of it. A humble beginning is rarely allowed to remain humble. It gets rewritten into a prophecy that was always fulfilled. Even the famous image of the eagle sign, so crisp in modern imagination, might have been sharpened over time, its edges cleaned by repetition. Symbols become more efficient when a state grows. A complicated past becomes inconvenient. A perfect sign gives everyone a single point to agree on, a single picture to carry in the mind. And once carried long enough, it feels like it was always there. But what if the first settlers saw many signs and chose one? What if rival factions argued over what counted as true guidance? What if the sign itself changed as politics changed? What if, in a world where calendars and omens were serious instruments, the interpretation of a sign was less like receiving a message and more like negotiating one? Because the Mexica lived in a basin that had already taught them how endings work. Teotihuacan had ended. Tollan had ended. The valley held ruins like warnings, and so the founding of Tenochtitlan may have carried not only ambition, but anxiety. If worlds can reboot, if sons can die, then a city is never simply built, it is defended against disappearance. Perhaps that is why ritual and construction intertwine so tightly in later Mexica life. The temple rises with the city, the calendar turns like a lock, offerings go into the earth like nails hammered into reality, as if the ground itself must be persuaded to keep holding. Yet there is one more silence to sit beside. If the city was engineered so brilliantly, if the fields were so productive, why does the founding still feel like it is floating between miracle and necessity? Why do we still not have the kind of clean, contemporary record that would settle the balance? Is it because the earliest records were among those that burned? Is it because painted histories were never meant to function like modern timelines? Or is it because the founding, like all beginnings that become sacred, was edited from the start, curated even before the conquistadors arrived, curated by the very people who needed the story to be more than practical? So the island remains shimmering in the mind, half sign and half strategy, half omen and half engineering. A city that begins as a precarious experiment and later insists it was fate. And the question that follows softly is not whether the Mexica were clever or devoted or both. It is this: if a capital can be built on water and then turned into inevitability by the right story, what else can be built the same way? And when the water is finally drained, when the stones are buried under a different city's streets, will anyone be able to tell where necessity ended and myth began? If the island city could be explained as both omen and necessity, then the next contradiction feels sharper, like obsidian hidden under water. How does a settlement that begins as tolerated nuisance, a tenant in the reeds, become the hand that collects tribute from others? The sources often describe this rise as swift, almost clean, as if ambition simply found its shape and the valley agreed. Yet valleys do not agree. They bargain, they resent, they remember. So what changed? Was it brilliance? Was it brutality? Or was it the quiet luck of being useful at the exact moment the old balance began to wobble? In those early decades, the Mexica are often seen through the eyes of neighbours who already had names, fields, lineages, and stone histories. The Mexica had hunger, and a god whose demands could be interpreted as destiny. They fought as mercenaries. They offered muscle where muscle was needed. They married into local power, because marriage can be a treaty that breathes. They learned how the basin worked, not from textbooks, but from the way insults were delivered, from the way tribute was extracted, from the way a city's pride could be stroked until it lowered its guard. And still, it is hard to shake the feeling that the story has missing hours. The chronicles jump from marginality to inevitability with suspicious grace, as if the uglier negotiations were edited out, or perhaps never painted in the first place. It helps to remember that the valley had a master then, or something close to it. Azcapotzalco, the Tepanec power, loomed like a dark roof over the lake towns. Their rulers extracted tribute and enforced a hierarchy that many endured because endurance is safer than hope. The Mexica, for a time, are described as subordinate to this order, bound by obligations pressured into service. It is easy, in later retellings, to make subordination feel like apprenticeship, as if the Mexica were patiently learning empire until it was their turn to hold it. But subordination is not romantic when one is inside it. It is a daily narrowing of choices, It is watching other people eat first. It is being reminded again and again that one's survival depends on someone else's patience. And then there is the question of motive, the question that turns every account into a mirror. When later sources describe the Tepanec king Tezozomok and the tensions that followed his death, are they reporting the brittle truth of a succession crisis, or shaping a moral drama where tyranny ripens into its own punishment? After Tezozomok, the story often pivots around Maxla, the ruler who becomes, in many versions, an almost necessary villain. He threatens, he humiliates, he pushes too far. The Mexica and their allies rise, the tyrant falls, the new order is born. The arc is satisfying, and that is exactly why it deserves suspicion. History sometimes offers satisfying arcs, yes, but people also write satisfying arcs when they need legitimacy to feel like justice. In the fog of that crisis, one figure moves with a strange, cold clarity. Tlacaelel, often described as a counselor, an architect of ideology, the one who helps remake the Mexica not only as a political force, but as a cosmic one. Some historians argue that his role has been amplified, perhaps even mythologized, turned into a single name that stands in for many decisions made by many hands. Others accept that a powerful reformer could have reshaped ritual, warfare, and memory. Either way, the discomfort remains. If an empire's rise is not only swords and alliances, but also a deliberate rewriting of what people believe about time and obligation, then where does politics end and reality begin? If a counsellor can persuade a city that it is chosen not merely to rule, but to feed the sun itself, is that persuasion faith, or is it control wearing feathers? The war against Azcapotzalco, when it comes, is often described as a turning point where the Mexica are no longer rented fighters, but authors of the valley's next chapter. They align with Texcoco, a city with its own wounds, its own claims, its own exiled prince returning with sharpened purpose. They align with Tlacopan. The Triple Alliance forms, a structure that looks stable from a distance, but stability is often just a truce between ambitions. The arrangement of tribute, the division of spoils, the careful balance of prestige, all of it suggests a machine being assembled, and machines, once assembled, begin to demand fuel. What is rarely said plainly in the softer retellings is that tribute is not abstract. Tribute is corn and beans and cotton, but it is also bodies moving under weight. It is families rearranged around quotas. It is local gods forced to bow to central schedules. Tribute is a kind of grammar imposed on other people's lives, and yet the Mexica did not invent the logic of tribute in a vacuum. They inherited it, refined it, expanded it. The basin had long practiced dominance through extraction. The Mexica simply became unusually good at it, and perhaps unusually honest about the sacred language that could justify it. Here the story begins to throb with another unanswered question. Did the empire expand because it was hungry for wealth, or because it was hungry for confirmation? In some interpretations, warfare becomes not only political but ritualized, a way of feeding the gods, a way of proving that the Mexica are still chosen, still favored, still necessary to the universe's survival. If that is true, then expansion is not merely ambition, it is anxiety management. It is the dread that if the war stops, the cosmos might notice the silence. But can anyone truly know how much of that was believed at the deepest level, and how much was taught because it worked? Even a sincere belief can be shaped by utility. Even a useful doctrine can become sincere when repeated across generations until doubt feels like suffocation. The chronicles describe reforms too, the sharpening of social order, the elevation of certain lineages, the hardening of hierarchy. The Mexica begin to present themselves not as latecomers but as rightful center. They draw on Toltec prestige, they claim inheritance, they frame their city as axis. And again, the old theme returns, the conquest of interpretation. A rising power does not only conquer territory, it conquers the story that makes territory feel deserved. But there is a missing fragment that keeps glinting. The Mexica were not alone in the empire they built, and they were not uniformly loved even within it. Many city-states retained local identities and grievances. Some cooperated because resistance was costly. Some benefited, at least for a time, from the new trade flows and political protections. Some likely hated the Mexica with a patient private hate. When later narratives describe a vast empire marching in synchrony, is that a faithful picture or a central illusion projected outward? An empire looks unified most often from the capital. From the edges, it can look like a weight pressing down, and weights eventually provoke hands to push back. There are, buried in the structure of the Triple Alliance itself, hints that the Mexica rise was never as singular as later myth implies. Tribute lists in codices, accounts of who received what portion, suggest a negotiated system where prestige and profit were continuously calibrated. If the Mexica later claimed the lion's share, did they do so because they earned it through military dominance, or because they rewrote the ledger of honor after the fact? And if they rewrote the ledger once, how many other ledgers were rewritten, quietly, between painted lines? The most dangerous lies are not the ones that invent something from nothing, but the ones that adjust proportions, the ones that take a shared victory and slowly recolor it until one name appears brighter than the rest. And yet, even as the machine of our empire begins to turn, the lake city continues to feel precarious in the background, like a candle flame that must be constantly protected from wind. The chinampas must be maintained, water must be managed, causeways must be defended. The city's brilliance depends on constant labor and constant coordination. So perhaps expansion also serves an internal purpose, to keep resources flowing inward, to keep the capital fed, to keep the social order stable by offering outlets for ambition and violence beyond the city's own neighborhoods. A growing empire can distract its own fractures by pointing outward, by making the horizon the place where problems go to be solved. But horizons have a way of returning. Conquer enough, and one day the map becomes too large to hold without trembling. So the rise of the Mexica begins to resemble a ritual in itself, a series of transformations that are both political and metaphysical, both practical and symbolic. Outsiders become tenants, tenants become mercenaries, mercenaries become allies, allies become architects of a new hierarchy. The valley, once a room of older ruins, becomes a room of new obligations, and the deeper doubt, the one that will not lie down, is whether this rise was ever stable, or whether it was built from the start on tensions that only looked like strength. because an empire that grows by extracting tribute and rewriting legitimacy is always haunted by two kinds of enemies: those outside who resent the extraction, and those inside who remember the earlier versions of the story. If enough people remember a different story, what happens when the capital story is challenged? And if the Mexica taught themselves that worlds can reboot, that suns can fail, did they sense, even at their moment of ascent, that ascent is the most fragile shape power can take? If the empire's rise depended on tribute and rewritten legitimacy, then the next contradiction is intimate, almost embarrassing in its quietness. How can a machine built for expansion also produce a city where people buy tomatoes and feathers, where children recite poems, where lawsuits are argued, where lovers meet in doorways, where jokes survive under the shadow of a pyramid? It is easy to imagine Tenochtitlan only as a throat that swallows wealth and breathes out war. But a city cannot live on ideology alone. Even a sacred story needs kitchens. Even a cosmic schedule needs laundry. And still, the difficulty remains. The closer one leans into daily life, the more the sources begin to blur again. The conquerors described what astonished them, and what frightened them, and what could be turned into proof. The missionaries asked questions that shaped the answers. The indigenous writers who survived learned how to speak in two directions at once, offering truth wrapped in caution, memory wrapped in legal necessity. So when a reader tries to step into the streets, is it the street that appears, or is it a stage rebuilt from fragments, lit by torches held by strangers? Yet some things are stubborn. Archaeology does not tell bedtime stories, but does not easily flatter either. Beneath Mexico City, stones and offerings have been found where the great precinct once pulsed. Layers of ritual deposits, shells carried from distant coasts, obsidian blades that still catch light like trapped night, animal remains, masks, ceramics, incense burners. The earth keeps receipts. It does not explain them, but it preserves the fact that someone paid again and again for the right to feel protected. And that, perhaps, is the heart of daily life in an imperial capital, the sense that protection is never free and never finished. They say the market at Tlatelolco could overwhelm the senses, a sea of bodies arranged into order: food, cloth, cacao, salt, fish, turquoise, paper, tools, slaves, flowers, dyes, medicines. Even the Spanish accounts, hungry for exaggeration, keep returning to the same shocked admiration. The scale, the regulation, the officials who watch disputes, the way value moved through hands as if guided by invisible rails. But admiration is not innocence. A vast market implies a vast reach, and a vast reach implies the pressure of tribute routes and enforced trade obligations. When a commoner buys cloth, is she touching simple commerce, or the edge of conquest pressed into a weave? When a noble sips cacao, is he tasting pleasure, or a distant province's compliance? In the calm of daylight, the city must have felt like a miracle of coordination. Causeways connecting island to shore, canals cutting through neighborhoods, canoes slipping past like thoughts that do not wish to be interrupted. But miracles have maintenance. Dikes had to be watched, aqueducts had to be cleared, garbage had to be carried away, the chinampas had to be dredged and replanted endlessly, as if the city were feeding itself with a rhythm that could never pause. So there is a question that comes in softly, like a finger on the pulse. Who did all this work, and what did they believe they were building? Did they feel pride, or only obligation? Did they see the temples as protection, or as debt collectors dressed in stone? Education, too, appears in the sources like a kind of disciplined tenderness. Schools for commoners, schools for nobles, training in speech, ritual, warfare, craft, history, ethics. A society that invests in formal instruction is admitting something frightening, that obedience does not come naturally. It has to be taught. But what was taught exactly? Morality? Yes, but morality braided to hierarchy. Skill? Yes, but skill braided to tribute. Poetry? Yes, but poetry braided to cosmic fear. When a young person memorized a hymn, was it comfort, or was it a leash that happened to be beautiful? They had books, painted histories, calendars, accounts, and then they lost so many of them. Or perhaps they were taken, or burned, or hidden, or recopied into other shapes until they became unrecognizable. That loss makes the city feel like a dream that can be glimpsed only in reflections. Still, some Nahua poetry survives, filtered through later collections, fragile as a mothwing. It speaks of flowers and song, of impermanence, of the world as something that slips. It is tempting to read those poems as pure philosophy, a civilization contemplating mortality with elegance. But the darker possibility is that impermanence was not merely a thought. It was a daily sensation. If the official cosmology insisted that the sun needed feeding, then the world itself was always on the edge. To live in such a city might have been to live with a quiet, constant tremor, as if the ground could open, as if time could restart without warning. Law and punishment appear too, with a sharpness that feels like polished bone. Accounts describe courts, judges, procedures, and penalties that could be severe. Such severity can be explained as order, as deterrence, as the price of keeping a dense capital stable. But it also suggests fear at the centre. A state that demands tribute and ritual compliance cannot afford too much private freedom. Not because private freedom is immoral, but because it is unpredictable, and unpredictability is poison to systems that believe the cosmos itself is a ledger. If the sun must be paid, then missed payments in society might feel like cosmic sabotage. Even sound becomes part of this question. The city was not silent. Conch shells, drums, flutes, chants, the shouts of vendors, the splash of paddles, the murmuring of canals, the roar of crowds during festivals. Some have speculated about acoustics and ceremonial spaces, about how architecture can amplify awe and obedience. A temple precinct is not only a place to see, it is a place to be physically moved by vibration, to feel small without being touched. When thousands hear the same drumbeat, is it worship or synchronization? When a priest's voice rises over the plaza, is it prayer or governance tuned to the body? And then there is the most difficult intimacy of all, ritual killing, the thing that modern retellings drag into the light like a trophy. The sources disagree on numbers, on frequency, on scale. Some reports feel inflated with horror, eager to justify conquest. Some indigenous accounts feel careful, neither denying nor indulging, as if describing a storm that must not be mocked. Archaeology confirms sacrifice existed. It does not always confirm the grandest claims. Between confirmation and exaggeration, the mind finds a fog thick enough to hide anything. So the question is not only what happened, but what the telling does. If an enemy describes a people as blood-drunk, the enemy gains permission to destroy them. If a state describes itself as feeding the sun, the state gains permission to demand bodies. In both cases, narrative becomes a blade. Who held it most steadily? And yet, even here, daily life refuses to become a single story. People still married, argued, traded, gossiped, prayed, got sick, recovered, failed to recover. The city's greatness was not a constant trance. It was 1,000 ordinary days stacked into a monument. The most haunting part is that ordinary days are exactly what vanish first from the record. Empires leave behind speeches, not whispers. They preserve coronations, not bedtime. They paint gods, not the tired hands that clean the courtyard after the festival ended. So perhaps the deeper contradiction is this. Tenochtitlan at its height may have been both astonishingly alive and already halfway edited into a myth. Even before the Spaniards arrived, the city was teaching itself how it wanted to be remembered. It was selecting images, sharpening symbols, smoothing contradictions into a story that sounded like destiny. And a story that sounds like destiny tends to invite an ending that also sounds like destiny, even if the real ending is messy, accidental, and full of human error. If daily life was a web of markets and schools and canals and songs, then what happens when a single foreign thread catches that web and pulls? How much of this order was resilient? And how much was held together by belief, by fear, by the habit of paying what the gods and rulers demanded? And if the city's heartbeat was synchronized by ritual and law, what would happen if the rhythm were disrupted, not by philosophy, but by something as simple as misunderstanding, as small as a cough, as indifferent as a virus? The city glows in the mind now, a bright island of stone and water, but brightness can be a warning. Sometimes the brightest lantern is hung where the drop is deepest, and if so, the question that waits at the edge of sleep is not whether the Mexica were civilized or savage, brilliant or cruel. The question is who benefits when a living city is reduced to a single convenient image, and what else quietly was erased while everyone was watching the spectacle. If the city's heartbeat could be synchronized by drums and law, then the next contradiction sounds almost like a lie the body tells itself to stay calm. How can a people write poems about impermanence, plant gardens in lake mud, argue cases in courts, and still keep returning to the stone steps where blood darkens and dries? Modern listeners often want one answer that cancels the other, as if tenderness and terror cannot share a single calendar. But what if the true mystery is that they did share it, and that the sharing was not an accident, but a method? And if it was a method, who taught it to feel like the universe's own demand? The Mexica spoke of the fifth sun, of previous worlds that had already failed, of gods who had sacrificed themselves so motion could begin. In that frame, life is not a gift so much as a debt. The sun is not a lamp but a mouth. If it is not fed, it stops. It is an idea that can make ordinary mornings feel temporary, like mist that will burn away unless someone keeps paying for it. And once a society accepts a cosmic debt, the next step is frighteningly simple. Someone has to be the accountant. Someone has to decide what counts as payment. Someone has to decide whose body becomes the receipt. Yet even here, where the story seems so clear, the record breaks into uneven pieces. The most famous descriptions of sacrifice were written by men who arrived horrified, or fascinated, or eager to prove that conquest was a form of rescue. Their numbers swell and shimmer. In some accounts, the killings become almost industrial, a spectacle so extreme it begs to be used as permission. But numbers are the easiest part of memory to weaponize because most people cannot verify them, and because large numbers do not feel real. They feel like thunder. Was that the point? Make it sound like thunder, and no one asks about the individual raindrops. And then there are indigenous accounts, sometimes closer, sometimes later, sometimes shaped by danger. Some speak with a kind of controlled precision, neither denying nor inflating, as if they are walking on a floor that might collapse if the wrong word is placed. Others lean into the cosmic logic, emphasizing necessity, debt, continuity. The listener is left with a question that does not resolve. Were the sacrifices described as enormous because they were enormous, or because the story of enormity served someone, either to condemn the Mexica as monsters or to portray them as a people carrying the terrible burden of keeping existence alive? Condemnation and glorification can look strangely similar when both are hungry for drama. Archaeology steps in like a quiet witness who will not speak in full sentences. It confirms sacrifice existed. It confirms offerings, cut marks, skull racks, ritual deposits. Excavations at the Templo Maya have revealed caches where animals and objects were arranged with care, and human remains that carry the signatures of ceremony rather than random violence. The famous Tzompantli, the skull display, is not only a colonial nightmare on paper. Physical evidence for large skull racks has been found in the ceremonial core, and yet archaeology also refuses to hand over the kind of clean arithmetic that would settle the argument. Bones can tell what happened, not always how often. Cut marks can reveal method, not always total scale. Soil can preserve fragments, but not the full ledger of years. The earth too has its erasures, so the mind wanders into a darker corridor. Perhaps the debate about numbers is not just academic. Perhaps it is a way of avoiding the deeper discomfort, which is that sacrifice can be both real and socially functional without being infinite. It can be ritualized, bounded by calendars and politics, and still be horrifying. It can be limited and still define the imagination. A society does not need to kill everyone to teach everyone that life is conditional. There is a term that returns in many discussions like a soft blade, the so-called flower wars, often described as ritualized conflicts aimed at capturing prisoners for sacrifice, especially between Mexica and certain rivals such as Tlaxcala. Some scholars have treated these wars as formalized, almost agreed upon, a controlled outlet that served religious needs and political pressure. Others have cautioned that the idea may be oversimplified, shaped by later narratives, or mistaken for a single policy when reality was messier. But even if the details shift, the possibility remains unsettling. What happens when warfare is not only about territory, but about bodies as currency? What happens to diplomacy when a prisoner is not merely a defeat, but a sacred commodity? And still, the person listening in the dark might ask something quieter. Did everyone believe this in the same way? Did a farmer on a Chinampa feel the sun's debt as an intimate truth, or as a state language that hovered above him like smoke? When a young student memorized hymns, did the words settle into the heart, or did they settle into obedience? It is tempting to speak of the Aztecs as a single mind, but every society is a room full of private thoughts. Even under strict ritual, people vary. Some are fervent, some are afraid, some perform, some doubt in silence because doubt is dangerous, and doubt, when it cannot speak, becomes invisible to history. There is another missing fragment that is harder to hold, because it asks about the victims not as symbols but as humans. Many sacrificial victims were captives, yes, but others may have been chosen through different mechanisms: tribute demands, enslavement, social punishment, perhaps even voluntary forms shaped by belief and honor. Colonial descriptions often treat the victims as anonymous, interchangeable. That anonymity is convenient. It makes the act look like pure barbarity or pure ritual and removes the messy reality of individual lives. But a skull is not a concept. A skull is the remainder of a person who once had a name, a hunger, a voice. The greatest violence in the record may be the way it turns those names into silence. Some modern interpretations suggest that the spectacle itself was part of governance, a kind of political technology. Architecture frames crowds. Ritual timing organizes the year. Public violence can bind a population through shared shock, shared awe, shared relief that it was someone else. The temple becomes not only a stairway to gods, but a theatre that teaches the city what power is. This does not require cynical priests cackling in the dark. Systems can become self-sustaining without anyone fully admitting what they are doing. A society can sincerely believe it is feeding the sun, and also benefit politically from the fear that belief produces. Sincerity and utility can sleep in the same bed. And what of cannibalism, the claim that keeps returning like a sour taste? Some sources insist it was widespread. Others argue it was rare, symbolic, or distorted by outsiders who could not imagine ritual consumption without turning it into a story of constant hunger. The evidence is contested, and the debate itself becomes another mirror. If the Mexica are cast as cannibals, the conquest gains a cleaner conscience. If the claim is dismissed too easily, the listener risks turning away from uncomfortable realities simply because they are uncomfortable. So the question remains open, not as entertainment, but as a warning about how easily bodies become arguments. Underneath all of this, the cosmology waits like a slow drumbeat. The fifth sun is a story of rebooting worlds, of endings that have already happened before. It is difficult not to wonder whether such a worldview trains a civilization to expect catastrophe, to interpret suffering as cosmic maintenance, to accept harshness as normal because the universe itself is harsh. But perhaps the more dangerous thought is the reverse. Perhaps the worldview did not cause the harshness. Perhaps it rationalized it. Perhaps it took the reality of war, tribute, hunger, and political fragility and wrapped it in a sacred explanation that made it bearable and therefore easier to continue. If that is true, then sacrifice is not only about gods. It is about a society trying to keep its own machine from shaking apart. It is about giving terror a calendar so terror feels controlled. It is about insisting that endings can be delayed if the correct payments are made. And if people can be persuaded that the sun will die without them, then almost anything can be demanded in the name of preventing darkness. So the unresolved detail that lingers at the edge of this part is not a number, not a statistic, not even a single ritual. It is the feeling that the line between belief and control is blurred on purpose, and that blur is one of the most powerful tools any empire can possess. If the Mexica could persuade themselves that blood held the sky in place, what happens when a foreign power arrives with a different sky story, a different debt, a different kind of fear? Will the old payments stop? Will the sun truly notice? Or will the real collapse come from something far more indifferent than gods? Disease, alliance, misunderstanding, the sudden snapping of a system that was always under tension. And if the fifth sun was never guaranteed, then one last question drifts forward, soft as ash. When the world later falls for them, will anyone admit it was human? Or will everyone reach for prophecy again because prophecy is easier to hold than chaos? If blood was imagined as a payment that kept the sky from slipping off its hinges, then the next contradiction arrives in the form of warnings. Because warnings are strange things. They pretend to come from the future, but they are usually manufactured in the after. They are a kind of mercy the mind gives itself when it cannot bear randomness, and the Mexica story, as it approaches its breaking point, becomes crowded with these dark lanterns, omens in the air, voices in the night, water behaving badly, fire that will not behave like fire. The question is not whether unusual events happened. Unusual events always happen. The question is why the tradition remembers them with such theatrical precision, as if catastrophe needed a script before it could be tolerated. There are famous lists repeated in different forms like beads counted in anxious fingers, a flame or a comet in the sky for many nights, a temple catching fire without an obvious cause, burning as if the gods themselves had lit it, lightning striking where it should not, a weeping woman heard in the darkness calling for her children, a bird with a mirror on its head, showing images of strangers and mountains and an arriving doom, water boiling, the lake rising and surging into streets, men with two heads, or bodies that seem to break the normal rules. Each omen has its own taste, a mixture of dread and poetry, and the whole sequence seems to guide the listener toward one conclusion. This was inevitable. The universe announced it. The end was written in the air long before the sail appeared. But inevitability is a sedative, and sedatives can be used on the living as well as the dying. When a people are conquered, there is a pressure, almost a spiritual pressure, to make the fall feel meaningful, to say, we were not careless, we were warned, the gods spoke. The world itself leaned toward this outcome. Prophecy can be a way to keep dignity when control has been stolen. It can also be a way to survive blame, because blame is a second conquest that continues long after the first. Yet prophecy can also be a tool for conquerors, because a conquered narrative that sounds fated makes conquest sound natural, like weather, like a storm that no one needs to answer for. So the omens become a fog where motives hide. Some of the most detailed accounts come from sources shaped under colonial rule, where indigenous informants spoke to friars who were trained to love signs, to interpret history as moral theatre, to see disasters as divine commentary. In such a setting, it is not difficult to imagine how pre-existing indigenous concepts of portents and sacred time could be reorganized into a format that pleased Christian ears. A weeping woman in the night can resemble biblical lament. A burning temple can resemble a warning from a jealous heaven. A mirror vision can resemble a providential revelation. The shapes are compatible enough to fuse, and once fused, it becomes almost impossible to know where one tradition ends and the other begins, and still one should be careful. It's too easy to dismiss everything as fabrication just because it is convenient. People do see strange things before a collapse. Stress changes perception. Political tension sharpens attention. In a dense capital where ritual calendars govern the year, the sky is already a text, and every unusual mark on that text will be read with hunger. If drought threatens crops, if tribute routes strain, if rivals refuse to stay quiet, if internal factions harden, then the city begins to listen differently. Ordinary accidents begin to feel like messages. The universe becomes loud because the mind is already braced for impact. There are more mundane fractures that do not need prophecy to be real. Droughts in central Mexico are documented in various ways across the broader history of the region. And environmental stress is the kind of slow violence that leaves societies brittle. A lake city depends on careful water management, on the maintenance of dikes, canals, and aqueducts, on labor that cannot be interrupted without consequence. When rains fail, or arrive at the wrong time, when crops thin, when hunger rises, the empire must keep extracting tribute to feed the capital, and extraction itself becomes more aggressive. This is how a state turns into a clenched fist without admitting it has become afraid, and fear does not stay in the provinces. It returns as resentment. It returns as refusal. It returns as alliances waiting for a chance to change shape. The Mexica Empire, for all its strength, was not a single stone block. It was a lattice of obligations. Some city-states cooperated because it benefited them. Others cooperated because the cost of defiance was unbearable. The Triple Alliance itself was a negotiated balance, and negotiated balances tremble when circumstances shift. Even in a well-run machine, the smallest changes in pressure can make old joints creak. It is tempting, in the calm of distance, to imagine Moctezuma Sioux standing alone at the cliff edge, hearing omens and losing his nerve. But a ruler is rarely alone, and fear is rarely individual. Court politics are their own weather system. Priests interpret signs, nobles compete, generals plan, merchants carry rumors that travel faster than armies. When stories of strange foreigners began to move along the coast, they did not enter an innocent mind. They entered a mind already trained to think in cycles, trained to think in returns, trained to think that time can repeat itself wearing a different mask. This is where the old Quetzalcoatl shadow becomes dangerous. Later traditions sometimes suggest that Moctezuma mistook Cortez for a returning god. Many modern scholars caution that this framing may be exaggerated or even largely shaped after the fact, a colonial narrative that makes indigenous people appear naive or makes Spanish victory feel cosmically sanctioned. Yet even if the literal claim is overstated, the psychological possibility remains more subtle and more interesting. A society that lives inside sacred history may not need to believe a man is a god to still be influenced by the gravitational pull of god stories. It may be enough that the stories exist, that they offer categories the mind can reach for when faced with something unprecedented. And unprecedented things do not arrive as clean facts. They arrive as rumours, as contradictions, as partial sightings, men on animals that seem fused with them, weapons that sound like thunder, disease that appears later and rewrites everything, alliances that shift in ways the capital cannot easily predict. In such conditions, decision-making becomes a room filled with smoke. The best choice is rarely visible, and afterward people will always pretend it was visible, because regret demands a clean target. So perhaps the true ominous mechanism is not a comet or a crying voice. Perhaps it is hindsight itself, which arranges chaos into a necklace of meaning, and then claims the necklace was always there. Perhaps the 10 omens, or 8, or however many a source prefers, are not a record of the sky, but a record of the human need to explain trauma. Because trauma is a rupture, and ruptures beg to be stitched. Omens are stitches made of story. Still, even story stitches are sewn into real cloth. Something was fraying. A state that teaches cosmic debt cannot easily tolerate failure, because failure is not just political, it is metaphysical. If the sun's payment is tied to imperial confidence, then any disruption, drought, rebellion, or bad harvest can feel like a crack in reality itself. And if a society becomes convinced that cracks are opening, it may respond by tightening control, escalating ritual, intensifying warfare, demanding more tribute, which creates more resentment, which creates more cracks. A self-fulfilling omen, built not by gods but by feedback loops. So the question that hovers at the end of this part is not whether the Mexica saw signs. It is whether signs were what they reached for when the machine began to tremble, because signs are easier than admitting fragility. And if a civilization begins to narrate its own nervous breakdown as prophecy, then what happens when the real shock arrives, not as a symbol, but as strangers stepping onto the shore with their own myths, their own hunger, their own certainty? When the first sails appear at the edge of the world, will anyone be able to tell the difference between an omen that warns and an omen that sedates? Between a prophecy that protects dignity and a prophecy that makes resistance feel pointless? And if the end is remembered as foretold, does that mean it was unavoidable, or does it mean someone later needed it to feel that way? If the omens were stitches in the mind's torn cloth, then the next contradiction is brutal in its simplicity. The catastrophe does not arrive as a symbol. It arrives as wood and canvas and breath, as foreign bodies stepping onto a coastline that had its own languages for danger. And yet, even here, the story refuses to stay solid. The more often it is told, the more it becomes a scene with costumes already chosen, lines already memorized. The strangers become either demons or destiny. the Mexica become either fools or monsters. Everyone becomes a role that makes the ending easier to digest. But what if the true horror is that the ending was not a single ending at all? What if it was a pile-up of misunderstandings, old grudges, opportunism, and biology, moving so fast that no one could name it before it was already inside the city? The first meetings on the coast, in the records that survive, feel like hands reaching through fog. Messengers, gifts, watching eyes, translation happening in imperfect layers. A word becomes another word, and by the time it arrives in the capital, it has changed colour. One can almost feel how power depends on that fragile chain. If a ruler hears that the strangers carry thunder, is that a literal description of firearms or an emotional description of shock? If he hears that these men ride beasts, does he imagine cavalry as a single creature because the mind tries to simplify what it cannot classify? And when the gifts are exchanged, gold included, is it diplomacy or is it bait? Or is it a misunderstanding of what the other side values most? Gold to the Mexica can be sacred brilliance, a substance of the sun. To the Spaniards, it becomes an obsession with weight. So even at the beginning, two universes touch and fail to recognize each other. Then the political truth steps forward, the one that later romances sometimes try to soften. The conquest was not a straight line drawn by a few Spaniards. It was a knot tied by many hands, including indigenous hands, because the Mexica Empire had enemies, resentments, cities that had paid tribute and waited for a chance to stop paying. Tlaxcala stands in the story like a blade held at the ready. Their conflict with the Mexica had history behind it, and that history made alliance with foreigners imaginable, even if the foreigners were unpredictable, even if their hunger was difficult to measure. It is tempting to judge that decision from a comfortable distance. But if a neighbouring power has been pressing on your throat for years, you may grab any hand that offers leverage, even if that hand later tightens around you too. That is one of history's cruel habits, escape routes that lead into other cages. So Cortés moves inward with allies, not merely soldiers. He moves with interpreters, with rumours, with the force that comes from being misunderstood in flattering ways. The figure of Malintzin, often called La Malinche, appears here as a presence that refuses simple moral labels. Translator, negotiator, captive, survivor, symbol, scapegoat. Translation is not passive. It chooses, it frames, it decides what tone the world will hear. But what choices were truly available to a woman trapped between armed men and political storms? If language is power, then being forced to carry language between enemies is a dangerous kind of power, one that can be used against you no matter what you do. The record loves to make her into an explanation, because explanations are comforting. But a single person cannot contain all the forces that were already breaking. And then there is Moctezuma, who becomes, in later retellings, a riddle with a crown. Did he hesitate out of superstition? Did he hesitate out of strategy? Did he try to absorb the strangers into the existing logic of diplomacy, gift exchange, hostage-taking, and ritual hierarchy? Was he paralyzed, or calculating, or simply operating with incomplete information in a situation where every option had clause? A ruler does not decide alone, but history often demands a single face to blame. It is easier to say a king failed than to say a system met something it could not quickly interpret. And yet, even if the myth of Moctezuma mistaking Cortés for a god is overstated, the deeper issue remains. When a worldview trains itself to see time as cyclical and sign-filled, novelty becomes harder to process. Not impossible, but slower. And slowness can be fatal when the other side is willing to improvise brutally. The entry into Tenochtitlan, described with awe by Spaniards and remembered with a tightness by others, feels like a dream with too much light. The causeways, the canals, the order, the scale. Some accounts sound like admiration, others sound like desire wearing admiration's mask. A city that looks like that becomes a prize in the imagination before it becomes a battlefield. And once a prize has been pictured, every interaction becomes part of acquiring it. Hospitality becomes a doorway. Ceremonial exchange becomes reconnaissance, and the Mexica, with their own traditions of diplomacy and controlled displays of power, may have believed they were managing a guest who could be contained. But containment requires shared rules, and here the rules were not shared. They were translated, and translation can break. Violence begins to leak in. The seizure of Moctezuma, a moment that still feels unreal when spoken aloud, as if a city could be held hostage by holding one man. Yet that is exactly how politics can work when legitimacy is concentrated. Hold the symbol and the system stutters, but symbols bleed. The massacre at the festival, often associated with tox cattle, becomes another rupture in the narrative, a flash of blades during what was supposed to be ritual continuity. Spanish sources and indigenous sources describe it differently, but both agree on its destabilizing effect. If trust existed, it shatters. And once trust shatters in a dense city built on coordination, the fractures travel faster than soldiers. Moctezuma's death becomes a contested shadow. Was he killed by Spaniards? Was he struck by his own people? Did he die from wounds, from stress, from the collapse of his position into impossibility? The truth is tangled, and the tangle itself has meaning. A contested death is a sign that everyone needed the death to mean something different. Spaniards needed a narrative where they were not simply regicides. Mexica factions needed a narrative where legitimacy could be reassigned. Later chroniclers needed a narrative that fit moral frames. So the king's body becomes another codex page burned in the middle, leaving only scorched edges to interpret. And then comes the enemy that does not negotiate: smallpox. It moves without banners, without speeches, without diplomacy. It arrives as breath and touch, and it turns crowded streets into corridors of mourning. Here the most frightening part is its indifference. It does not care who is noble, who is priest, who is warrior, who is child. It attacks the social fabric itself by removing the people who hold skills, memory, and authority. A lake city depends on coordination, on labor and knowledge passed between bodies. Disease breaks those chains. And unlike a battle, disease also breaks meaning. If people believed they could pay the gods and delay darkness, what happens when death arrives in a form that does not respond to payment? What happens to faith when the ledger stops matching reality? The siege that follows is not a single scene, but a long tightening. Causeways become choke points. Water becomes both protection and trap. The Spanish-built brigantines turning the lake into a weapon against the city that once mastered it. Starvation creeps in. Thirst. The slow collapse of routines. The Chinampas cannot feed everyone when access is cut. The aqueduct is targeted. The canals that once carried food and gossip carry fear instead. In this stage, heroism and desperation blur. The defenders fight with ferocity, and the attackers, with allies, grind forward with a mix of discipline and hunger and calculation. When the city finally falls, it is not only a military defeat, it is an ecological defeat, a logistical defeat, a biological defeat, a defeat of translation and trust. It is also, uncomfortably, a civil war hidden inside the word conquest. Many indigenous groups were not passive spectators. They were active participants, and that fact does not reduce the tragedy, it deepens it. It means the Mexica were defeated not only by outside force, but by accumulated resentment inside the system they built. It means the empire's tribute machine had created its own enemies and stored them like dry wood, waiting for a spark. When the spark came, it did not need to be large, it only needed to be timed. And now, the contradiction that will not rest. If the fall can be explained by alliances, weapons and disease, why does it still feel, in many tellings, like a scripted fate? Perhaps because a collapse of this scale is hard to accept as contingent. Perhaps because contingency is the most terrifying god of all. But if one listens closely, another possibility whispers underneath. The Mexica had long lived among ruins, among reminders that greatness ends. They had built their own legitimacy on earlier endings. In a basin trained by past collapses, maybe everyone, deep down, understood that permanence was the only myth that never survives. So at the edge of this part, the listener is left with a question that does not want a neat answer. If Tenochtitlan fell through a convergence of human decisions and indifferent microbes, where exactly does responsibility live? In the ambition of Cortes, in the resentments of tributaries, in the rigidities of imperial ideology, in the fragility of a lake system turned into a fortress, or in the stories that came afterward, the stories that made the fall sound pre-written, because a pre-written fall is easier to mourn than a fall caused by mistakes that could have been made differently. And if this collapse was not destiny, but a chain of breakable links, then what other collapses in human history have been wrapped in prophecy after the fact, not to illuminate truth, but to numb the living into acceptance? If the fall can be explained as a chain of breakable links, then the next contradiction is almost cruel. Why does the story keep moving, even after the city is broken? Not in the way a victor's story moves, clean and declarative, but in the way a wounded story moves, crawling, changing shape, learning to breathe through new lungs. Because Tenochtitlan did not simply disappear, it was dismantled, repurposed, translated, argued over, prayed over, built into and built against. And in that long afterlife, the question becomes less about how an empire died, and more about how a past is controlled once it can no longer defend itself. The stones did not vanish. They were lifted and carried and reset into new walls. The sacred precinct became a quarry for another sacred geography. Churches rose where temples had stood, not merely because it was practical, but because replacement is a kind of statement. The new god does not arrive beside the old god. The new god arrives on top. Water, too, was disciplined. The lake that had once made the city feel like an impossible bloom was gradually constrained, drained, redirected, forced into channels that served colonial priorities. A lake city once made of reflections became a city of dust and sinking ground, as if even the landscape was required to forget what it had been. And when the environment is rewritten, memory loses one of its strongest anchors. How do you remember a world of canoes when your streets insist there was never water here? Yet erasure is never complete, and that is where the unease returns, because the conquerors did not simply burn books and walk away. They demanded explanations. They demanded lists, genealogies, tribute accounts, confessions, translations, all of it pressed into alphabets and legal formats that the old world had not asked for. Some Nawar nobles and scribes adapted with extraordinary intelligence, painting and writing what they could in forms that might survive the new courts. But survival has its price. When you preserve your history in the language of the people who conquered you, you're also letting that language decide what counts as history. A painted glyph that once carried layers of time like a dream now had to behave like a document with a date. A song that once held memory and metaphor now had to become testimony. And testimony under colonial pressure rarely tells the whole truth. It tells what can be safely said. So the surviving record becomes a room full of double voices. In works assembled under friars, indigenous informants speak with precision and restraint, sometimes condemning old rituals, sometimes preserving them inside careful phrasing, as if hiding embers under ash. One can feel the tension, the way a people might try to keep their ancestors human without giving their conquerors more reasons to hate them. Some accounts emphasize order, morality, law, education, the beauty of poetry, because beauty is a shield. Other accounts lean into sin and darkness, because that is what the new regime expects to hear, and meeting expectations can keep you alive. Which version is truer? Or is the truest thing the fact that both had to exist at once? Even the famous compilations that modern readers treat like windows are also mirrors. A friar who asks questions is not neutral. His theology is already an interpretive net. If he believes the devil disguises himself in local gods, then every answer will be pulled toward that gravity. If he believes history is a moral drama, then events will be arranged like moral drama. And indigenous collaborators, brilliant and careful, will learn how to speak through the net without being caught entirely. That kind of speaking creates texts that are invaluable and unsettling at the same time. They preserve details no one else preserved, yet they also preserve the shape of the cage in which those details were spoken. Then centuries pass, and the afterlife becomes layered. The Mexica past is used by colonial authorities as a warning, a tale of pagan error. Later it is used by emerging national identity as a foundation, a heroic root, a symbol strong enough to stand against Europe even while being filtered through European forms. A single civilization becomes a resource mined by different eras, each era chiseling out the statue it needs. And when a past becomes a resource, the missing parts become especially dangerous, because whoever controls the gaps can control the meaning. Fill the gaps with horror, and conquest looks like salvation. Fill the gaps with romance, and collapse becomes an aesthetic tragedy rather than a political lesson. Fill the gaps with inevitability, and no one has to ask who profited from the violence. And still, the ground refuses to stay silent. In the late 20th century, the accidental discovery of a massive stone disc linked to Coyosoqui near the center of modern Mexico City forced the old sacred precinct back into public view. Excavations that followed revealed the Templo Mayor not as a vague legend but as a layered, rebuilt reality, a structure expanded again and again like a heartbeat leaving rings. Offerings emerged in dense, deliberate arrangements, marine shells carried inland, obsidian, animal remains, carved stone, objects placed with a precision that suggests not chaos but system, not random cruelty but cosmology, enacted with hands that believed what they were doing mattered. Archaeology does not rescue anyone from moral discomfort, but it does remove the easy excuse that the city was only a story. It was real enough to leave its teeth in the soil. Modern science adds its own quiet disturbances. Pollen studies, sediment cores, ecological reconstructions hint at how fragile the basin system was, how water, salt, farming, and urban density formed a tight coupling. It becomes harder to treat the empire's end as purely spiritual punishment or purely military drama when the landscape itself looks like a stressed instrument. The more tightly tuned a system is, the more catastrophic a sudden shock can be, and disease, arriving with outsiders, was not just a tragedy of bodies, it was a tragedy of expertise. Skilled labourers, engineers, farmers, healers, administrators, all removed in waves. A city is not stone. A city is coordination. When coordination dies, stone cannot keep pretending to be alive. But here another missing fragment opens, colder than the rest. If the conquest reshaped the archive, then how many Mexica truths are still present but unreadable, because the key was lost? Nahuatl words survive, but their full tonal world, the everyday idioms, the humor, the private skepticism, the intimate vocabulary of doubt may be mostly gone. Painted glyphs survive, but their reading traditions were disrupted. Even when modern scholars reconstruct meanings, reconstruction is not the same as being inside the meaning the way a living community once was. And this is where the seduction of certainty becomes most dangerous. People want the Aztecs to be a lesson, a warning, a symbol, a mirror. But the more a civilization is used as a mirror, the less it is allowed to be itself. So perhaps the afterlife is the final conquest, the one that does not require weapons. It requires only selection. Which sources get taught, which images circulate, which artifacts become icons, which complexities are trimmed away because complexity does not travel as well as spectacle. A skull rack becomes a headline, a poem becomes a footnote, an imperial tax system becomes invisible behind the drama of sacrifice. An indigenous political alliance becomes less interesting than a story where a handful of Europeans defeat millions, because that story flatters certain myths about power. And the last thought, the one that refuses to sit down gently, is that the Mexica themselves understood something about this. They lived among older ruins and called them sacred. They inherited silence and built legitimacy inside it. They knew that when a civilization dies, it can be turned into a tool by whoever comes next. They were not naive about memory, they were practitioners of it, which means the final mystery is not only what Spain destroyed, but what the Mexica curated even before Spain arrived, what they polished and standardized, what they made misty on purpose, what they hid inside myth because myth is harder to prosecute. If worlds can reboot, as their cosmology suggested, then the reboot is never neutral. Someone decides what version of the story loads first. Someone decides which files are corrupt and which are sacred. Someone decides what the next generation will call truth. So the question that remains, soft as a candle struggling in a draught, is not whether we can ever know the entire history of the Aztecs. The question is whether the desire to know it is already being managed by forces that benefit from certain versions of the past staying incomplete. And if the archive is a battlefield that never stops, then when you close your eyes tonight, who is arranging the fragments for you? And what, quietly, is still missing because its return would change the present too much?